21 diversified economies seeking one common goal, an ambitious plan for open and free trade within the Asia-Pacific region. Join us this weekend as CCTV speaks with Alan Bollard, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. He shares his views on how APEC members are stepping up their game to achieve sustainable growth and free trade. Only on Biz Talk.
The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, better known as APEC, is a group of 21 economies which share the goal of promoting free trade and economic cooperation across the region. Its members account for 40% of the world's population, 44% of international trade, and more than half of global GDP. But at a time of economic crisis, APEC is challenged to boost regional integration, advance a free trade area in the Asia-Pacific, as well as reduce trade barriers and cut tariffs. I will speak here in Singapore at the headquarters of APEC to the Executive Director of the organization's Secretariat, Dr. Alan Bollard, about these issues, as well as the expectations for China to host the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in 2014.
Set up in 1989, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, counts 21 members, including most countries which have a coastline on the Pacific Ocean. Since its establishment, APEC has held annual meetings with representatives from all its member economies. When APEC leaders gathered in Bogor, Indonesia in 1994, they committed to achieve free and open trade and investment by 2010 for industrialized economies and by 2020 for developing economies. APEC members agreed to pursue this goal by further reducing barriers to trade and investment and by promoting the free flow of goods, services, and capital. These targets became known as the Bogor Goals, an ambitious manifestation of APEC's common belief that free and open trade and investment are essential to realizing the growth potential of the region. To meet these goals, APEC carries out work in three main areas: trade and investment liberalization, business facilitation, and economic and technical cooperation. At this year's APEC Trade Ministers meeting in Surabaya, Indonesia, members agreed to develop a regional connectivity framework to lower business costs, bring people together, and enhance the region's economic resilience.
The framework will bring greater coherence and add impetus to ongoing connectivity-related work in APEC.
China is set to host the 2014 APEC Informal Economic Leaders Meeting. The GDP of the world's #2 economy accounted for only 3.5% of the 15 APEC members when it first acceded to the organization back in 1991. But by now, that proportion has risen to nearly 40%. Under the APEC framework, China has developed many economic projects and is seeking deeper cooperation with more APEC members.
Dr. Bollard, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.
The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation was set up in 1989. In a nutshell, what are the most significant achievements of APEC over the last 24 years?
Yes, well, it's been a big organization with a big impact over that time period. It started off with agreement amongst the major economies as members that they would work at reducing trade barriers and investment barriers. And initially that meant reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers and also making investment principles more transparent. As that improved, and it has considerably over that time period, there's been more work going on behind the borders. So that means what we would call trade facilitation, making it easier to move goods and services and capital across borders, and also business facilitation, making it easier to set up businesses in these economies, and also trying to get similar sorts of regulations in place across economies.
APEC aims for free trade and investment by 2020 for developing economies. They are known as the Bogor Goals. Where are exactly the hurdles and where is the progress being made at this point in time?
The more countries and the more economies are able to trade, the more integration you get between them, the more chances you have of increasing income and improving living standards for people in those different economies. And that's been driving the Bogor Goals. The Bogor Goals also were an agreement amongst the APEC economies that the more developed economies should be on a track to go faster to reduce barriers. They had a target of 2010 to get free, what we call free and open trade and investment. The developing economies, 2020. So they're still working on those. How much have they been achieved? Well, it never said there would be complete removal of all tariff barriers, and there hasn't been complete removal, but there's been huge progress made. So in the region as a whole over that period, tariffs have come down from an average of around 18% to about 1/3 of that level. There's still progress to go. There's still a lot of work plans in place.
The APEC region is characterized by a vast diversity, culturally, historically, economically, you name them. Now, this very vast economic disparity that exists in the region is obviously a major challenge. What can APEC do to lower these disparities and narrow the gaps between the different development stages in the countries?
Generally, APEC has proceeded by emphasising that it's a voluntary arrangement. It doesn't put in place legally enforceable undertakings. It tries to be as transparent as possible. It reaches consensus. It reaches decisions by consensus. And if there's some areas of work that not everybody would agree to, then they can push ahead with what they call pathfinder projects. There's also been a lot of work going on what we call capacity building, so looking at gaps and putting things in place and building up workshops, guidelines, consultants' advice and so on to help economies build up capacity to do these things.
China will host the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in 2014. What are your expectations for China being the host?
What leaders and ministers are doing are saying what the priorities are for China. We'd expect the broad directions of APEC to continue, regional economic integration, the continued focus on growth with equity, sustainable growth with equity, and building capacity in the economies around the region as well. But China will decide what particular sorts of priorities it wants to put in place within those for the year. I would expect it would pick up on some of the work that's already underway from Indonesia this year, quite likely on particular areas of connectivity and improving infrastructure through the region. But it will be up to China later this year to decide on just where those priorities are. They'll put a huge effort in logistically and intellectually to lead the debate about where APEC goes through that year, but also to organise all the meetings, or many of the meetings that are necessary to keep it in place.
Bustling markets, flashy skyscrapers, streets filled with brand new shiny cars. These are all the scenes of a region that has been called the world's engine of growth. But the teetering global economic growth and Eurozone debt crisis have challenged the whole world, including APEC members. However, the region seems to be bucking the trend and achieved a real GDP growth rate of 4.1% last year. It's expected that this figure could climb up to 4.2% this year and reach 4.7% in 2014. Weak demand from developed countries due to the crisis has, without a doubt, hurt some export-reliant APEC economies. To avert the impact, they have shifted their focus on domestic consumption, as well as economic restructuring. It's working. Rising demand in emerging markets has helped drive growth in the region. Now APEC members are trying to better cooperate to maintain sustainable growth.
I don't look at connectivity just in a context of building a bridge or building a road, but I look at it more in the context of building people-to-people contact, so that there's more capacity building and the ability of anybody to basically transfer know-how and also move up the value chain.
Still, the negative effects brought by the quantitative easing policies in the United States remain a challenge. APEC members must strengthen regulation in the financial sector and channel more liquidity to the real economy, such as infrastructure construction.
Annual GDP growth in the APEC region grew by around 4.1% in 2012. In April, the IMF cut its global growth forecast to around 3.3%. Where do you see growth in the region heading this year compared to global growth?
Yes, well, of course, we've been through the global financial crisis. It was a very big event in the Asia Pacific as in the rest of the world. But generally, it didn't see the same damaging effect and scars around this region as has, for example, happened in Europe. We're still tracking progress out of that. There was a big drop in trade at that time. Now, that's of some concern because it's been a trade-driven economic growth model for so many economies around this region. Over the last couple of years, there hasn't been growth in trade. It's recovered, but there's not been much growth in trade volumes. But we have seen growth in the economies themselves, on average, getting up to around 4%. This has partly been driven by economies like Indonesia and some of the larger ASEAN economies that have actually managed to stimulate domestic demand. And of course, China has started doing that as well. And that does mean some changes in growth in the future. We think we'll see reasonable growth this year, improving slightly on the last couple of years and then continuing to improve next year. But that's not to say there aren't uncertainties around. We've got the United States still pulling out of its quantitative easing mode. Japan with still quite unorthodox monetary policies and stimulation, intense stimulation in place. And of course, against all of that, there's the quite difficult economic situation that Europe finds itself in, and of course the Asia-Pacific trades to Europe as well.
Now, investments, the rise in regional trade and also domestic consumption, they seem to be the main contributors to this growth. What are the key drivers and challenges for growth in the APEC this year?
I think it's coming to terms with the slightly different growth pattern after the global financial crisis. We've seen some economies that have done a lot of stimulation of their economies, and they have to help rebuild their fiscal outlooks. And of course, the United States is one of those. Japan will be very interesting how it gets on this year with a lot of fiscal and monetary stimulation and big structural change that they're talking about. But in other economies, there's been some good growth, but in addition, there's been some impacts from the quantitative easing countries. So we're seeing capital flows moving around the region, and that's pushed into push up asset prices, stock markets, and in some other economies like Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, quite a lot of pressure on exchange rates as they've pushed up as well. Now that's made it quite difficult for those economies to stabilise while they continue to grow, but they've generally been pretty solid.
Rewind back to 2008. The global financial crisis is raging, threatening the collapse of financial institutions, forcing the bailout of banks, and sending world equity markets down the hill. In this time of need, governments across the globe got busy negotiating new trade agreements in a desperate attempt to fuel economic growth. Today, two of the most important ones are the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. But although talks have kicked off, the conclusion is probably months, if not years away. The final TPP pact would cover nearly 40% of global economic output and 1/3 of all world trade. TPP talks are officially slated to conclude this year, but many experts expect them to stretch into 2014. Meanwhile, the RCEP includes the 10-Nation Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, as well as Japan, China, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Their first round of free trade talks took place in Brunei in May. For APEC, the top goal is to set up a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. The idea arose due to the deadlock in the Doha round of World Trade Organization negotiations. In December, the WTO Ministerial Conference will take place in Indonesia's island paradise of Bali. It is seen as the last chance to revive the global trade negotiations after the collapse of the Doha round in 2011. A failure will most likely lead to a rise in further regional trade agreements.
The APEC region accounts for around 44% of international trade, a massive number. But last year, due to weak demand from Europe, the trade value decreased and only rose by about 2.6% in 2012. What is your forecast for trade volumes this year with the world?
We don't make a specific forecast, but we agree with a number of forecasts out of the IMF and other organisations that basically say we're starting to see trade recovery after 2 quite flat years of trading, and that should continue. But will it get back to those very strong days of 5-10 years ago? Possibly not. And what we want to make sure at APEC is that the environment is in place that people can make the best decisions about where they invest and where they trade from and where they trade to, so that ultimately we can see incomes grow around the region and people can get better off.
Several Asia-Pacific countries and the United States are currently discussing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Pact, and they are also going to discuss that during the Indonesia APEC Summit. What kind of outcome are you expected? Will any deal be reached during the TPP talks?
They've now moved into formal negotiation, and there'll be more discussion on those. They've got their own timetable, but that's a TPP matter for the economies that are in those, roughly half of the APEC economies. The role of APEC in that, I think, is it's been twofold. One, APEC as an incubator of ideas, as new ideas come out, and that's where that's come from. Secondly, keeping an eye on those proceedings to ensure that they're as transparent as possible and following APEC broad goals of free and open trade and investment. And thirdly, possibly leading to more work on how they fit, how they integrate with other moves around the Pacific, because at the same time we've got what we're calling the RCEP negotiations going on. So that's, broadly speaking, the ASEAN negotiations with some other partners in there as well, including India, including China, Korea, Japan. And those are on a different negotiation track.
Top representatives from WTO countries will also meet in Bali once again in December to try to revive the WTO Doha round of trade talks. What is your outlook for these talks, and do you think that the long-stalled talks can be advanced?
Well, I think everybody has agreed that the Doha round of the talks are really very hard to restart. There's been so many different positions taken in them. And that's been WTO, of course, has formal signed-up agreements for talks, and that's been a big advantage, but it also makes it very much harder to get the next round going. And so I don't think people are expecting to see a big breakthrough there. I think what they're saying is that the other roles of WTO, disputes resolution, capacity building, etc., remain very, very important, and that they're seeing WTO moving into sector-based agreements. We have a hope that we might see the Information Technology Agreement from 1996 re-agreed and updated, and that would be a big move if that's the case. But will we see a big sign-up to a Doha round at Bali? I don't think so.
Last year, regional leaders, they launched the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that would create the world's biggest free trade zone and include 10 ASEAN members as well as 6 others, including China. What is your view on the RCEP, and how would it complement APEC's goals?
Now they're interested in taking that further, and they've said who would like to join them, and the economies like China and India have joined in. Northern Asian economies like Korea have, and southern ones like Australia and New Zealand have. So now you've got a very wide range of economic groups there, and they're just starting negotiation. It's too early to say how this is going. It's expected this will be a longer, slower track than the TPP one, because it's got more emerging economies in, and they'd be probably moving more slowly, but that's not clear.
What other regional trade agreements or free trade agreements are currently negotiated at the APEC level, and when would they be implemented?
One of the interesting ones is the Pacific Alliance, which includes Mexico, Chile and Peru from APEC, and also Colombia. And they've been doing some interesting things in a slightly different way, but they're very keen on improving their trade with Asia and amongst themselves. And so they've been prepared to take some quite big steps, including political steps of having some joint representation in trade around the world. And APEC is looking at that as well and looking at what we can learn from that.
In a world ridden with financial crisis, scenes like this is a rarity. But here, in the small family-owned fashion distribution outlet, this is the norm. Growth has been steady for Martin, one of the founders of Blue Pandore's distro, over the past 10 years. From originally selling 300 items per month, now he's moving 300 items per day. And there is still room for growth.
The market for small and medium-sized enterprises are still very big, especially selling local products, who can have more competitive prices and adjust the characteristic to local taste.
These kinds of small-medium enterprises are exactly the kinds of businesses that the leaders of APAC are trying to develop as a mechanism to shield against financial crisis. APAC is also pushing ahead with the ambitious Bogor goals, where they have committed to achieve free and open trade and investment by 2010 for industrialized economies, and by 2020 for developing economies.
Now, the key is to be consistent with respect to the three sub-themes of the overarching theme, and those would relate to, the connectivity, and then making sure that the sustainable or the growth within APAC is sustainable, but also with equity. And of course, the third sub-theme would be the continuing liberalization of trade and investment.
The progress is welcome, but for businesses like Blue Pandore's, they're more concerned on what APAC can achieve for making their day-to-day business easier.
I think if APAC can help facilitate the ease of exports, it would be good for businesses like us to penetrate overseas markets. Some kind of exhibition where businesses like us can meet and talk.
In your opinion, what are the main hurdles and challenges for economic cooperation and trade liberalization in the region?
Well, we didn't take it for granted that we would continue to see that sort of intra-regional trade at a time when the world was going through such difficult problems with the global financial crisis. We were quite concerned back in 2008, 2009 when world trade suddenly slowed. We were very concerned that we might see a growth in traditional trade barriers like happened in the 1930s. That hasn't happened. We have seen some growth in disputes at WTO, for example, but we haven't seen a growth in trade barriers, and that's been very important, and APEC has been one reason why that hasn't happened. In addition, we didn't want to see investment barriers go up, and that's broadly, we haven't seen those either. We do have to be a little bit cautious about monetary flows around the region. With quantitative easing, there's been some big pressures around some of these economies as a result of that. But provided that starts reverting to normal in the next couple of years, we don't expect to see significant damage out of that as well.
The mobility of business people is another key focus area for APAC, and you want to ease the regulations for business travelers, you want to streamline the immigration processes, and also set up a APAC business travel card scheme. Where do we stand at the moment in terms of making business easier for business people and make travel easier for business travelers?
Well, I think that's been one of the big achievements of APEC. We have leaders and ministers stating some broad goals, often long-term, lofty goals they would like to see met. Then we've got a whole series of working groups, 40 or 50 of them, that are meeting all the time to try and get similar standards, transparency, and sometimes some quite practical ways of helping goods, services, capital, and people get across borders. And the APEC Business Travel Card is a good example of that. It's a travel card system that's been signed up to by 19 of the 21 economies. That includes China, for example. And those economies that have signed up make it easier for business travellers to come in and out of airports and points of entry. And they also make it unnecessary to to get business visas for a limited period for business travel on the country. And if you ask business people around the region, they say that's one of the huge things. It's made things very much easier.
APEC's goal number one is the liberalization of trade. Now, tariffs were cut from 17% in 1989 to around 6% in 2011. By comparison, average world tariffs, they stood at around 10% in 2011. By how much further should tariffs be cut?
Yes, they have been very successful in doing that, and I think the expectation and the hope around APEC is that it goes further. There's some areas that haven't had much, or anything as much in the way of cuts, and that would include agriculture. Then we will always see new areas coming up, and as I just said, the environmental goods agreement has been one area where that's been a real focus. In addition, there is just agreement that we shouldn't see any reversion on that we shouldn't see barriers going up, and generally that's been the case as well. There's more work to do, but there's also, as those tariff barriers have gone down, businesses have said actually the tough stuff now is behind the borders, not at the borders.
There is a proposal for a free trade area in the Asia Pacific, which arose from the deadlock of the WTO Doha round of trade talks. Now, if this zone is being created, it will be bigger than ASEAN Plus 3, which is China, Japan, and South Korea. When can we consider such an establishment? What kind of data do you see in the future?
Yes, it was in 2010 that leaders agreed that the APEC economy should move to a broad, wide, free trade agreement. They deliberately haven't specified a date. They deliberately haven't yet specified exactly what that means or a footpath to it. What they're doing at the minute is waiting and watching progress, particularly on TPP and RCEP. That's the ASEAN plus other members negotiation, to see how those develop. Now, they could develop in a very strong, positive way directly towards an FTAP broad Asia-Pacific agreement. They could be slow, they could run into problems, and they could diverge from one another. That would be damaging if that was the case, and no one wants to see that happen.
Great. Dr. Bollard, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.